Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Future Security Initiative. Many of you are familiar with what we do. We are a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank, and we engage a variety of security issues from a holistic perspective. This is the second to last event in our fall speaker series for the 2024-2025 academic year. We're thrilled to have Seth Harp with us. He is a future security fellow at New America, which means that he's one of the people who is part of the class of New America Fellows, one that we support through our New America ASU partnership. And it's a very competitive fellowship. Several hundred people apply for just around 15 or so slots, and we're really excited about being able to support Seth and about his upcoming book. He's going to speak about the subject of this book. And Seth is investigative reporter, a foreign correspondent who writes about the intersection of armed conflict and organized crime. Before becoming a journalist, he practiced law for 5 years and was an assistant attorney general for the state of Texas, where he lives. During college and law school, he served in the U.S. Army Reserve, and he's a contributing editor at Rolling Stone, has reported from Iraq, Syria, Mexico, Ukraine, and elsewhere, and is published in Harper's, The New Yorker, The New York Times, and the Texas Observer. So following our usual pattern, Seth will discuss his subject, which has to do with drug trafficking among the special operations community. And then I'll moderate a discussion, and please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. And Seth, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everybody for being with us tonight.
Thanks very much, Professor Rothenberg. I really appreciate that introduction. And I greatly appreciate the support that I've received from the New America Foundation and the Future of War Initiative. As you said, you invited me here to talk about the subject of the crisis of ethics in special operations. And I wanted to say a little bit about, by way of background, about how there came to be at least the perception of a crisis of ethics in the special operations community in the U.S. military. What I see is the causes of that and some recommendations and predictions for what's going to happen possibly in the future. We just had a big election that's going to have a significant effect, I think, on policy in this regard. My recommendations as far as what I think could be done ideally to ameliorate some of the conditions that have led to some of the more egregious instances of operators behaving badly. Which, as Professor Rothenberg said, is the subject of my forthcoming book, which is called The Fort Bragg Cartel. So I guess I don't need to spend too much time talking about why it is or how it came to be that the special operations community came to occupy the sort of vaunted position in not only within the military, where there's a sense of hero worship toward this community, but also in our larger culture in American society, where we have so many movies and so many cultural products that valorize the figure of a commando, whether it's a bearded Green Beret, who has a keffiyeh wrapped around his neck and a AR-15 in his hand, or assault weapon, or a Navy SEAL kicking down the door. I mean, this is someone who, during the global war on terrorism, was a GWAT, as I'll call it. During the GWAT, this figure came to occupy a really prized position in our culture, as I said. And there was a certain point, a certain inflection point, which I would date roughly more or less to about 2016, maybe a little bit before that, in which there was a darkening in public perception towards special operations, when there were multiple media scandals, one on top of the other, that really sullied the Navy SEAL brand in particular. But at the same time, there were similar incidents that were taking place in the Army Special Forces that maybe didn't get quite as much attention in the press, but certainly contributed to a sense among the public and in the military as well, that things were getting a little bit out of hand in the special ops community, which at that time, of course, had been at war for 15 years. So I want to list a few of the cases, a few of the most salient cases, which probably a lot of folks in the audience will recall. But I guess the first one was when, after the assassination of Osama bin Laden, after the killing of bin Laden in Pakistan, that's when you saw really the apex of the Navy SEALs as a cultural phenomenon. And that's when the sort of SEAL brand was at its most prestigious. But it was shortly after that, which several of the people that were involved in that operation by SEAL Team 6 and the CIA, several of those individuals came forward and either wrote books or appeared on television or otherwise tried to take credit for having been, the guy who shot bin Laden. And that was the public being treated to a spectacle of these guys bickering about who actually did it. That to me was the first sign of trouble ahead. Um, Next, there was an incident that took place in the nation of Mali, where the Joint Special Operations Command (JSOC) has had a presence since the early 2000s, in which Delta Force and Team 6 routinely deploy, as well as the Special Forces groups and the SEAL teams. Um, there was an incident there in which two Navy SEALs that were on DevGru tried to uh, assault, and I think their intention was to sexually humiliate on video camera one of their colleagues on the Special Operations Task Force, a Green Beret from Fort Bragg named Logan Melger. Um, Probably a lot of people that are watching this or listening to this recall this case. Um, the SEALs claimed that it was a prank gone wrong, but investigations into it revealed that, in fact, the individual who died, Logan Melger, had tried to report these SEALs for stealing operational funds, for bringing prostitutes back to their barracks, and also for using drugs and other things that they shouldn't have been doing. And so there was a darker element to that story than the official one, in which it was just a prank gone wrong. In any event, both of those SEALs were criminally prosecuted, and it was another sign that these guys were existing in a sort of fringe in which they could get away with anything that they wanted, a sense of impunity, a growing sense of impunity and criminality, to be frank. The next case was certainly the most famous, which was the case of Eddie Gallagher. While the trial of those two Team 6 operators that I just mentioned was ongoing, several SEALs who were deployed in the war against ISIS and had been fighting in Mosul came forward to the Naval Criminal Investigative Division, or NCIS, as it's called in the Navy, to report their team chief, Eddie Gallagher, for allegedly indiscriminately shooting men, women, children, the elderly in a deranged quest to top Chris Kyle of American Sniper fame, who claimed to have killed, I'm not sure how many people, but Eddie Gallagher apparently being on drugs, taking steroids, taking tramadol, and other substances, other illicit substances. And his mindset was trying to kill as many people as he possibly could. And even in these rather hard-bitten Navy SEALs who don't make a habit of reporting one another for anything and really live by a culture of silence, they were so appalled with their own chief that they came and turned him in. And then Eddie Gallagher became a sort of hero, despite the fact that his own teammates had turned him in, despite the fact that his conduct was antithetical to what the official credos of the armed forces are. Eddie Gallagher became a celebrated cause, especially on Fox News and other cultural institutions. And it became defending Eddie Gallagher became a sort of perverse kind of patriotic pride sort of thing. And his trial devolved into a three-ring circus. President Trump at that time intervened. He had made it part of his personal brand as a politician to advocate for accused war criminals, despite the strength of the evidence against them or the gravity of their crimes. And this case was no different. The court martial was almost derailed because of President Trump's command interference, allegedly at that time, or borderline command interference. But the case was ultimately resolved in a way that I thought was highly suspicious, having reconstructed 3 criminal trials for the purposes of the book that I'm writing, the trials of the killers of Logan Melger, the trials of Eddie Gallagher, and the trial of a Delta Force operator who I'll talk about in a moment, named Cristobal Vallejo. They all ended with these very strange acquittals, or just there were more surprises in any of these trials than an episode of Matlock. There were all these twists and turns, and in all three cases, you saw the perpetrators being exonerated, which was not an ideal outcome whatsoever for public perceptions of military good order and discipline in the special operations community, because I think, as most people in naval special warfare would readily acknowledge, it would have been much better to prosecute Eddie Gallagher to the fullest extent of the law, to emphasize that U.S. forces, even though they're out there taking people's lives every day, they're following certain rules of engagement and abiding by the laws of war. On the contrary, the trial of Eddie Gallagher and the result in which he was acquitted, for folks who weren't paying close attention to the trial, it was tried. The government's case was tried by a young guy who had never tried a murder case before, which is remarkable. And ultimately, he walked into an old mob trick in which one person who's already been granted immunity takes responsibility on the stand for the murder, which is just a jaw-dropping surprise ending to the case, which, as I said, was a notorious trick used by the mafia in the trials of old, which this prosecutor just was wholly unprepared for because he was just a captain. Um, I lost my train of thought for a second there talking about the Eddie Gallagher case, but I think what I was trying to say is that the outcome was very bad for naval special warfare and for the special operations community more generally, the fact of his acquittal. So a few other cases, I don't want to get too far in the weeds because I know that we're limited in time, but I don't want to give short shrift to Army Special Operations, even though they're a little bit more they're a little bit more adept at sidestepping scrutiny than the SEALs, which have very much become sort of black sheep of the special operations community. Anytime somebody really screws up, it always seems to be a SEAL. But in fact, in Army Special Ops and the Green Berets, there was a case in 2018 of a couple of Special Forces soldiers, veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, named Daniel Gould and Henry Royer, who were trafficking $1 million quantities of cocaine from Colombia, where Sergeant First Class Gould was stationed on a solo plainclothes mission doing something nobody knows in the Colombian city of Cali, where, in fact, by himself, being unsupervised, being there for so long. He told me in letters that he's now in federal prison. He told me that part of that, and this is what we'll talk about later and what I see are the causes, the autonomy that he had, all the time in which he was alone, the lack of supervision, and his proximity and access to sellers of cocaine and people that were involved in organized crime is what provided the temptation to which he succumbed, which was to buy wholesale coke and smuggle it to the United States on military planes, in fact, that were departing from the U.S. Embassy compound in Bogota, landing at Duke Airfield in Florida, which is a special operations airfield near Pensacola. And they were finally caught because one of their officers got wind of what they were doing and turned them in. And so they just immediately went and pleaded guilty. But nevertheless, the fact of Green Berets trafficking coke was not good. Another one was the killing of Mark Leshiker, which took place at Fort Bragg that same year, right around the same time. In fact, March 2018, a Delta Force operator with severe PTSD named Billy Levine shot and killed his best friend, in fact, at his house in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And the military authorities and civilian authorities covered up the crime. And I use that term advisedly after really considering every piece of evidence that's available and attempting to talk to the authorities about what happened. They simply covered it up and papered it over and made it look as if it had been self-defense when in fact it was murder. Billy Levine was then allowed to remain an operator on Delta Force. That case didn't come to light at that time. And not until 2 years later, a year and a half later, when Levine himself turned up murdered on Fort Bragg alongside another longtime JSOC soldier, JSOC adjacent soldier named Timothy Dumas. And both of them had been involved. This is the subject of my book, so I won't delve too long into it because it's probably the most extreme example involving the most homicides, the most high-level crime. But both of these individuals, Timothy Dumas and Billy Levine, were involved in trafficking cocaine at a high level. And both of them had spent um, almost 20 years each in special operations and had done many, many deployments, particularly to Afghanistan. Um, so I've said enough about those army cases. For now, there's many other instances of homicides and drug crimes at Fort Bragg that I can get into. So this has been a subject of several stories that I've written that have caused some churn at the level of the Pentagon and Congress. The commander of SOCOM um, was questioned over a lot of these incidents. The commander of USASOC was relieved of duty after the Fort Bragg murder. The story I wrote for Rolling Stone was published. Um, so I don't know how much attention I can say it's gotten in the public at large, but certainly within the military, I think my reporting and the reporting of plenty of other reporters who have worked on the same topics has gotten the attention of folks in the military, where there is an acknowledgement of this phenomenon, which I call the crisis of ethics. And proof of that is that the commander of Naval Special Warfare um, sent out a directive, I believe, in 2019, acknowledging that the command had a problem and that there was a need to correct, that there was a need to restore ethical compliance. Part of those reforms included things like all the guys having to shave their beards, get rid of their pirate patches, get standard haircuts, quit dressing and acting like a motorcycle gang, and start acting like soldiers. And in Army Special Ops, there's also been some public acknowledgement of this. I know that USASOC's Special Warfare magazine, which they put out through the Special Warfare Center and School, devoted a whole issue to the perceived crisis of ethics in Army Special Ops. And there's widespread agreement that this is really a thing that needs to get a handle on. So all that being said, I'll talk a little bit about what I think are the causes of this. Why we've seen so many of these cases one on top of another, because the ones I mentioned are just the most prominent. There's quite a few more that you could explore. So number one, of course, being at war for 23 years straight. Our country has been at war constantly since 2001 through its own policy, not because war was imposed on this country, but because it has been U.S. policy to continue prosecuting wars in the Middle East, in North Africa, and Southwest Asia, um, nonstop, and to put special operations increasingly at the forefront of that. For the first 2 or 3 years of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, these wars of choice, the special operations were not especially emphasized. It really wasn't until the surge in Iraq in about 2007 and when the Obama administration came in 2008 that U.S. war policy became almost entirely driven by special operations. And that puts a wear and tear on the force, a lot of wear and tear on the force. People get, for guys like I mentioned, Billy Levine doing 14 deployments, with about 10, not maybe 9 deployments with JSOC, which are incredibly intense. At the height of the assassination programs in Iraq and Afghanistan, men who have been through that, it's not surprising when they come home and suffer psychological problems and tendencies towards criminality, anger issues, violence, addiction, substance abuse. All of these are natural results of people being put through the ringer, people being used up, used as military parts and got as much mileage out of them as you possibly can, and then bring them back to the United States, give them disability, give them a pension, and expect them just to live out the rest of their lives in peace. Well, a lot of them are not capable of doing that. And to the extent that our country remains at war, then we're going to see more of the same phenomenon, sadly. I mentioned Dan Gould, the Green Beret who was smuggling cocaine into the U.S. On military aircraft. He ruminated at length about the causes of what led to the wearing down of his ethical compass and how he perceived it. And he, like others that I've researched and interviewed who were involved in trafficking narcotics, blames, they didn't have a need for money. In most cases, none of them needed the money. They did it for the thrills. They did it for the challenge. They did it because after a life in covert operations and being given free reign in a lot of the countries in which special operations operate, um, it creates a need for that kind of sensation, for that kind of thrill seeking, for that kind of danger. Once a guy's brain has been bounced around enough times, he really only ever doesn't feel depressed when he's in danger. Um, and you'll see that mentality in people who have spent more than a decade at war in which they're rotating into combat for 4 months out of the year for more than 10 years, if not 15 or longer. Um, Another, I think, cause that must be acknowledged is the sort of sense of entitlement, hero worship exists in the military. It's been a very conscious choice on the part of American war planners to create a two-tier system because the U.S. public does not like seeing casualties when there are substantial casualties, as there were in the Iraq War from 03 to 07. You're going to get a major political backlash against that. And so, in order to sustain continuous war operations, in order to enrich the military industrial complex, which is at the core of US government policy and its function and reason for being, in order to keep that machine running, you can't sustain large numbers of US casualties. So, the compromise that's been drawn is to have special operations lead the charge because special operators being highly drilled tend to not get themselves killed, tend to be able to carry out ops without incurring casualties and working through proxy, especially like the Green Berets. That's their whole thing is working through training up and working through foreign and indigenous proxies. So that's the reason why we have it, but that just increases the burden on special operators. And also you have, it's kind of like this double-edged sword. On the one hand, they have this entitlement, hero worship, sense of privilege. We're the guys that actually do the fighting. We're the ultimate badasses. That's how they're made to feel continuously. You're constantly told that you're the best of the best when you're in naval special warfare or you're in USASOC. And people start to believe that. And they get, a sense of privilege, a sense of impunity, a sense that they can get away with anything, especially when the nature of their work is inherently unethical in a way. These guys are not playing by the rules. That's irregular warfare. They're doing clandestine operations. They're doing assassinations. They're doing spying. There's something schizophrenic in setting up and creating units that specialize in those type of activities and then expecting them to come back and be good citizens. You have to have a really strong executive function and ability to compartmentalize in order to do that. And in many cases, that's lacking. So I'll say a bit about what I think would be some good reforms that could take place that would put a lid on these cases popping off every 6 months or every year of either a Green Beret or a SEAL or an Army Ranger. I haven't said very much about during this, but there's been a lot of cases in the Army Rangers too, for what it's worth. Some guys who have robbed banks, others who have committed crazy shootings. The Army Rangers are definitely a part of this as well. So some of the ways that we could some positive reforms that could be implemented. Well, one, it might seem unrealistic, but we could stop doing new foreign wars if the U.S. government, if our State Department and CIA could stop or desist from starting wars every 18 months. That would be a really the single most positive thing that could be done. But unfortunately, the current administration and the next administration as well, because of the personnel that are in them, whether that you want to call them neoconservatives or liberal interventionists, they just live for starting new wars that don't need to take place and implementing aggressive policies in regions of the world that are unstable in order to create more instability, in order to insert military forces and create wars for the profit of their corporate sponsors, and then losing those wars. Because, I think another important part of this, which I will say something about now that I think about it, very important part of this is that the United States has lost every single war that it's been in since 2001. So we lost in Afghanistan, we lost in Iraq. Some people will try to argue that the surge was a temporary victory, but that was absolutely not the case because we had to come back to Iraq in 2014 when ISIS emerged as a direct consequence of the Iraq War. The US tried to overthrow the Assad regime in Syria using JSOC and the CIA. That failed. Assad is still in power. In Libya, they knocked over Muammar Gaddafi. That turned into what Obama himself said the biggest mistake of his presidency. Obama, in Obama's words, it was a shit show. After Gaddafi was gone into that anarchic field, rushed all of these warlords and jihadists that had been stirred up by JSOC and the CIA and other special operators from NATO and NATO intelligence agencies that they couldn't handle afterwards. Bandits, slave traders, drug traffickers ran wild over Libya. Libya was one of the biggest disasters that we've seen. And a lot of the guys that I'm talking about served in that. And all of these conflicts is why I mentioned them. This is not just a diatribe against US foreign policy, although it can be taken as such. But the reason that I'm delivering it now is to emphasize that all of the people that I'm talking about who have come in for these negative, come in as exemplars of special operators behaving badly. This is what participated in. And the fact that all of those operations turned into disasters, and the fact that there was a cynicism in the public perception towards them and a curdling in public perception towards wars like Libya, wars like Syria. I haven't even said anything about Somalia, Yemen, Mali, all these other places where US objectives went completely sideways, even measured by their own metrics, to say nothing of the loss of lives and innocence that had taken place. Millions of people killed. And, in Ukraine as well, the US pushed very strongly to provoke that war. And through special operations, I pore over guys' enlisted records and officer records all day long in the course of my work that I've obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, and I can see all of them. All of a sudden, around 2012, 2014, deploying to Finland, deploying to Latvia, deploying to Ukraine itself, talking to their family members about the things that they were doing. They were clearly pushing for that conflict and ensuring that Russia would be backed into a corner and forced into making a really tough decision. So that was another instance of starting wars that the people that I'm talking about serve in and have their moral compasses and they're destroyed and levied with this are saddled with PTSD, other disorders, particularly substance abuse. And it's seemingly for nothing because wars like Ukraine do not turn out as they're supposed to. Russia has won the war in Ukraine, or has ended up with more territory than it started with, which is one good way to define victory in war. Other U.S. operations around this time, it's hard to think of a single one that resulted in the accomplishment of what the U.S. objectives were at the time that they started. And so that, I think, besides just continuous operations, the fact that all of the wars had been losses greatly contributes to the crisis of ethics in special operations, because these guys feel like they're just mercenaries and they're not really doing things that are valued by the American public. Most of the time, the American public either doesn't know what they're doing, or to the extent that they know, they think it's a really bad idea and that the US shouldn't be doing those things. So that's a major part of it. So that's my number one recommendation: stop starting new foreign wars. Another positive reform that I think that could take place would be to de-emphasize special operations in the hierarchy of the armed forces, because as it is, we have very much a two-tier system, or you could call it a four-tier system, in which you have JSOC, Black Ops, special operators at the very top, second tier vanilla special operators at the second tier, Army Rangers, SEAL teams, and then a third tier being all the support soldiers and special ops, all the intel guys and girls, gals, women, and men in SOCOM who are doing civil affairs, who are doing PSYOPs, who are doing other support roles, intel, etc. And then you have a lot of contractors. So that's really a four-tier system in which all of the benefits are mostly reserved, whether it's prestige, pay, privileges, just the sort of intangible cultural things. All of the rewards are really concentrated in the top. and of the military. And so that I think has deleterious consequences for what we're talking about in this sense of ethical crisis. So I think that you could have a more, and ideally, you would have a more of a smoothing out, of more of an emphasis on the conventional military, which is in really rotten shape right now, ridden by suicide crisis and all kinds of other cultural problems. Recruiting has fallen through the floor. Um, and I think a big part of that is the extent to which the conventional military is seen as just kind of a humdrum thing that really just, just supporting the special operations component of it. Um, and I think that would be a positive benefit not only culturally for our own military and social fabric, but also for actually winning wars. Because if you're going to win a war, I want to pause here. There's one war that happened in my lifetime in which the U.S. won. The U.S. clearly accomplished its stated objectives before the war started. A lot of times the objectives change along the way. Um, and that was, of course, the Persian Gulf War, in which the invading Kuwaiti army was driven out, the invading Iraqi army was driven out of Kuwait. And then the U.S. packed up and went home. So, and that war, uniquely among U.S. interventions in the last 40 years, involved almost no special operations, although there were some. Some pedants out there who know the history really well will get mad because there were some. However, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who was a theater commander, had a kind of an old school aversion to special operations. He didn't like Navy SEALs and Green Berets. He still had a sort of Vietnam era hang up on him about it, which was the case in the 70s and even into the 80s. Special operations was not a place where any ambitious officer would want to go to. It was a total backwater with a whiff of infamy about it. And Norman Schwarzkopf shared that opinion. And so special operators were kept on a very short leash and kept mostly on the sidelines. We won that war. That's an anecdote, doesn't prove my point. However, I believe strongly that more conventional operations would be successful, or at least I can say for a fact that special operations driven, proxy force driven, intel driven missions, light footprint, the whole Donald Rumsfeld thing, that hasn't worked at all because all the wars that have been waged that way have ended up in defeats. So we got to try something else. And in my view, the way to win a war would be to commit a large number of troops and accept casualties. That's the only way that you're actually going to win. And that's only politically acceptable when the cause for which you're fighting is clearly just. And that doesn't apply to any of the armed conflicts that are taking place right now involving the United States. Let's see, what else have I got here? Another thing is kind of getting into smaller issues. I think we're kind of running out of time here. I'm coming to the point where I think we want to take questions. I don't want to give anyone short shrift on that. Real quickly, I think we could, a lot of the privileges that are pertinent to special operations, their own doctors, their own everything. They have basically a fully segregated system. We don't need to have that segregated system. That's what's incubating a sense of privilege and entitlement that's causing these soldiers to act out in this way. Break down the two-tier system, make everyone follow the same rules. You got to get the same haircuts. You have to have the same tattoo policies. Questions of basic accountability. Drug testing is a really big one. Everybody knows that in special ops, you can get around drug testing. Everybody knows that drugs are a big part of being in special operations, that there's a lot of cocaine use, methamphetamine use, hard drug use across the board, steroid use. All of that, in addition to heavy drinking, is part of the culture. It certainly has been, especially during the latter half of the GWAT. So everyone having to take drug tests is a big part of it, of making everyone play by the same rules. So to very briefly wrap up with some predictions, because predictions aren't worth very much, I basically would predict that none of these recommendations that I've just talked about will be implemented by the Trump administration. In fact, Trump's election in 2016, I think, was a major contributing factor in the ethical crisis of special operations because of the way that he surrounded himself with some of the craziest people in the special operations community, and the way he championed war criminals who were pariahs in their own military institutions. So getting out even farther in front of, what the most sort of pro-military point of view is actually doing damage to the military by purporting to to champion causes like Eddie Gallagher. But look who's just been appointed the Secretary of Defense, is Pete Hegseth, who's as a Fox News host, held up the case of Eddie Gallagher, and was a champion and advocate for Eddie Gallagher's exoneration. So um, there's a decline in the quality of personnel who are at the top of DoD, and he's a signal example of that. And he's a guy who really thinks that the best way to improve small unit discipline is to just let them do war crimes. So that's a really scary thing to know. You realize that to the extent that these organizations are going to hang together during the next 4 years, it's going to have to be through their own internal ethics and accountability imposed by career Army officers who aren't as crazy as someone like Hegseth. Um, Unfortunately, there's a lot of neoconservative appointees to positions in State Department, CIA, and who can be counted on to start new wars and to lose them. And because that's what they've done for the last 23 years, and they show no indication of having learned any lessons. Iran is in the crosshairs, and so is China. And that's not to say, lest somebody think that I have a political axe to grind. I mean, just now, President Biden has authorized the launching of long-range missiles into into um, into Ukraine, excuse me, into Russia. And I saw the tweet from the Russian, I don't know what he is now, but Putin's protege. He said that, issuing a very stern warning about, what this means for Russia in terms of nuclear escalation, which is probably the single most insane thing that any U.S. president has ever done in my lifetime, to directly strike the Russian mainland, or authorize it to be done with U.S. weapons, which, if I'm not mistaken, are operated by U.S. personnel. Both administrations are equally inculpated in belligerence and warmongering, which is the primary cause, as I've said several times now, in what I call the crisis of ethics and special operations. So because I think we're going to see wars continue, because I think we're going to see additional loosening of restrictions and rules of engagement, something that Trump did the first time around, because I think we're going to see Trump again advocating for the cases of anybody in the military who's been either reported by their own comrades or who has been criminally charged as a result of the military's own law enforcement purposes. Trump championing those causes, all of that is going to contribute, if history is any guide, to a worsening of the crisis of ethics and special operations. So very sad, sincerely sad to predict that I think it will continue and also worsen. So with that, I'll wrap up. I know I've been talking for at least 20 minutes now. Yeah, and I'll turn it over to Professor Rothenberg.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Seth. That was a fascinating presentation. What's particularly interesting about what you're saying is that it's widely viewed, I think, that the special operators are not just the heroes of these last conflicts, but the most effective actors within them. And part of what we've seen is a really massive increase in the size of special operations, not just in the reliance on them, but just how many more people have entered into it, both because of its fame, but maybe also because of just the needs, the demands of these conflicts from those in charge. But I'm curious if your read on this reflects on broader questions about war. One thing you said was that there was something inherently unethical about the work of special operations. Certainly, that's not how it's presented formally by the US government, right? But could you expand on that? Is this really inherently unethical? And by unethical, do you mean it's inherently in violation of the laws of war, or that it's unethical in some other way? What do you mean by saying
that? Thank you. That's a great question. I'd be happy to expand on that. So it's unethical unless there's a larger good that's being pursued. When you're doing clandestine operations, when you're doing assassinations, when you're doing spying, that kind of thing is inherently duplicitous and violent. You know, special operators themselves are kind of schooled or indoctrinated in these kind of ideas, that they're not there to play by the rules. They're there to engage in irregular warfare. So to the extent that they're ordered to do it consistent with the laws of war, for a proper cause, or for a righteous cause, let's say, then it's not inherently ethical. It's not unethical, on the whole. But the point I was trying to make was like a kind of a rather subtle one. I'm not trying to say that that being in special operations is inherently unethical. It's more that, when you're schooled in these type of tactics, then there can be a natural progression or a slippery slope in which you lose the grounding, and you start doing secretive, violent criminal things in your own city, in your own country. Like take someone like Billy Levine, who was doing assassinations in Afghanistan, wearing civilian attire, sneaking up on people in the middle of the night, breaking into their house and shooting them all dead. Well, he comes back to the United States, and there's a certain loss of equilibrium, a certain loss of mooring. He had lost faith in the war in Afghanistan, and he had lost faith in the jihad itself. And so he starts, in his demented state, carrying out doing those same type of crimes in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
So, but it's probably fair to say that these are fairly isolated cases, that it's not, there may be an ethical crisis within special operations, but it's probably unlikely that large numbers of special operators are going on crime sprees or trafficking in drugs. Um, what does the leadership say when you bring up these stories? They clearly have commanded a radical increase in the numbers of special operators. And let's be honest, they've largely celebrated special operators as the key to where there have been substantive successes, whether in Iraq, or in Afghanistan. I mean, special operators ran much of the actual combat efforts, if you think of special operators broadly, including Rangers, from 2014 on. So really in the latter 10 years of U.S. Afghan operations. So my point is, what does the leadership say when you bring to them, through your writing, uh, you know, a, a deeper critique, not just revealing particular stories of criminality, but a deeper critique of the overall increase in reliance on special operators?
I think it's certainly the case that the majority of people in special, I don't waste too much time with that caveat, maybe I should, um, that for the most part, we're talking about exceptions here. These are exceptional cases, and they're only worth talking about to the extent that they illuminate something that is more broad and that affects others to a lesser extent. But I would say that there are some types of criminal activity, that possibly affect or are possibly involved in a majority of individuals in the use of SOC or naval special warfare, particularly drug use.
Mhm.
And I'm not the only reporter who's drawn attention to this. Another great book on this subject is called Alpha, the book about Eddie
Sure.
Gallagher by Dave Phillips. And he documents really extensive widespread drug use and abuse of prescription pills and in the Navy SEALs. And he wrote some articles in the New York Times as well about how the drug use goes early on, starts in SEAL training, in BUDS itself. And I have found that to be the case in Army Special Ops as well. I wrote an article about overdoses at Fort Bragg, where there's more overdoses at Fort Bragg than in the civilian population, which is really wild because overdoses are incredibly high right now. And the fact that there's even higher rates at a military base, the most elite Army base, suggests deep penetration of a culture of drugs in Army Special Operations. And several of those took place among Green Beret trainees who are still in school for it. And then there's other cases of Green Berets trafficking, millions of dollars worth of cocaine and other drugs. So I think that but I think this is a great opportunity to point out something that I think holds true broadly, which is that Dave Phillips wrote about the contrast in the SEALs between what he calls the pirates, and I'm not sure what he calls the other guys, but basically, there's a strict bifurcation, or a very salient bifurcation between, like the sort of teetotaler warrior for God, like no drugs, no alcohol, straight arrows, there are a lot of those guys in naval special warfare and also in Army special operations, a lot of them who will listen to what I'm saying and it won't connect with them at all. They'll think I'm wildly off base. But there's another contingent that, call it roughly 50-50 of guys who are just complete derelicts who are engaged in all kinds of criminal behavior, whether it's, drug use, and there's another big problem in at least Army special ops with sexual assault, and the pervasiveness of guys getting sexual assault charges. So um, I think that I wouldn't want to give the impression that I'm trying to inculpate or blame the entire community. That's not the case, but it's the exceptional cases that pop up and indicate that there could be a significant underlying problem.
So we have quite a few questions here from folks in the audience. From Hendrix Bailey, do you think the United States Special Forces are still operating within Ukraine, or did they withdraw once covert operations became more risky?
They are still operating in Ukraine.
Could you elaborate?
Um, Special operations have been active in Ukraine for many years. As I mentioned before, spending time with enlisted records of operators, seeing their deployments to the areas around the Baltic Sea. I was in Ukraine. I reported on the Ukraine war in 2022. I had a source, a well-informed source, tell me President Biden announced that all special operations have been withdrawn. But of course, when you're talking about JSOC, you're talking about covert actions which the government officials are legally permitted to lie about. So notwithstanding the statement of President Biden and other top security officials that there were no U.S. military personnel in Ukraine, my sources informed me that there were in fact what's called advanced force operations. This is like Delta Force G Squadron type of stuff, Black Ops. That was taking place before the Russian invasion and continued as the Russians invaded Ukraine. There were a couple of CIA officers, incidentally, who their black stars went up on the walls of CIA headquarters, I think that October, which is, and it was just telling. But in any event, there were those Discord leaks that showed the deployment of NATO special operators in Ukraine sometime later, but it confirmed what I had reported, and then a short time later, the New York Times also reported it. And since then, there has not been any change in U.S. policy. If anything, U.S. involvement in Ukraine has escalated. There are operators who are on the battlefield who are basically trafficking weapons to the Ukrainians and helping them set up weapon systems and use them. I don't know that anybody would doubt that there's U.S. military personnel currently in Ukraine.
We actually hosted in 2022 a retired special operator who spoke about training Ukrainians. This is between 2014 and 2022, and made the statement that a lot of what the Ukrainians were doing to successfully repel the Russian invasion of 2022, was based on training that had been provided by special operators, not necessarily clandestinely, right? But that was at a time when Ukraine was doing better in this conflict. But I'm wondering, what do you think about that sort of argument? The argument that in fact this training was substantive to the rather exceptional performance of Ukraine, given the army they were up against.
I think special operators are very good at what they do. The marksmanship, physical fitness, proficiency with weapon systems. Some of them have language capabilities. I don't doubt that for a minute. You're talking about men who are extremely type A, dedicated to their work. And in a sort of narrow bore sense, are very good soldiers, the best soldiers. But the paradigm of prosecuting wars with special forces at the fore has not worked because of the long track record, 20+ year track record of failed operations, including Ukraine, I would count in the failure category despite local successes. And maybe you could argue that some of those were the result, those local successes were the result of special operators training and imparting a high degree of efficiency to Ukrainian proxies. Nevertheless, on the whole, The contrast would be with a war against Russia that was fought directly with conventional troops. I know that putting aside the nuclear thing, so it's impossible in this circumstance. But the paradigm of special ops proxy war doesn't work. We've tested it maybe 7 or 8 times in the last 20 years, and in no case could you say unambiguously that it resulted in a victory. We have our conditions, or excuse me, our expectations have been so lowered by all these losses that there are many people who look at Ukraine, who support the Ukrainian people's legitimate, desire for independence and so forth, and sympathize with that, and have nothing but these local successes to think are to set up and imagine our successes. But we're kidding ourselves if we think that. Russia is very satisfied. Vladimir Putin and his regime are very satisfied with how the war has turned out. And so my point is about my critique of the efficacy of special operations is not to say that any individual operators are not good at what they do, or that the people that they work with haven't had these local successes, but that the larger paradigm doesn't work, and we need to try something else.
I mean, just we're getting close to end of time, but I want to like read one a comment from Craig Meyer. I'm an ASU grad, attended on the GI Bill, was at Fort Bragg in the 82nd Airborne. I liked your comment about special ops guys taking on the look of biker gangs. They need to get rid of that image. More of a comment than a question. And then from David Miller, a related point, which is asking about your service. And then I would add to that, have you served is the question. And then could you reflect on maybe your military service and how that's affected, influenced your reporting, how you communicate with special operators, or just generally your engagement with the issue?
Thanks for the question. I was in the Army Reserve when I was in college, and that was when the war in Iraq started. And so I was called up to serve in Iraq when I was 19 years old. I served there for 1 year, and was in combat. My unit was in the central parts of Iraq, around Baghdad and Balad, Tikrit, all those areas, Samarra, and being exposed to combat at such a young age, and also the sort of collapse of the legitimacy of the Iraq War, which took place right in front of my eyes, so to speak, from 2005, 2006, really influenced me. When I came back home, I started writing for my college newspaper to criticize the Iraq War and say that we shouldn't be doing this. We started this on false pretenses, and things over there are going terribly, and operations are mismanaged. And because the GWAT nevertheless continued apace, I've basically been beating that same drum, as tiresome as it is, ever since then, nearly 20 years now. So that was definitely
From Sam Peterson, what are your thoughts on the prevalence of traumatic brain injuries as related to these crimes? It's fairly well documented that TBI runs rampant in the special operator community, both from injuries obtained in training and also from combat operations.
I think that's quite possible. I don't have the medical background to really talk too much about the TIVX to TBI. Sometimes I would caution that that is thrown around a little bit too much as an easy explanation, easy excuse. I don't know that the science on TBI is all that settled. I do know that there are physicians who have a more skeptical take on the correlation between traumatic brain injury and criminal behavior, or behavioral problems, or mental illness. But it may well be, because you're talking about people who are exposed to a lot of explosions and get knocked around quite a bit in the course of their jobs. So that could be a big factor. I'm not quite sure. There's also institutional bureaucratic incentives in place for people to claim TBI injuries, which they're hard to document. They're hard to document. They're hard to see. They're hard to detect. So you can claim TBI, you can get disability. There may be some of that on the margins that are inflating the numbers about TBI. Nevertheless, I think it's something that is very much worth paying attention to, and questioning whether there's ways to mitigate that, and seeing whether that might improve some of these things as well.
On a related point, leaving aside TBI, because there's some complexity to understanding it, there's timelines, but what about PTSD, a very general concept that is obviously very well studied, it's been around for a long time, clearly significant. How does that play into your understanding of what special operators are experiencing and how it affects them?
In contrast with TBI, there's zero doubt that PTSD is a huge part of everything that I've been talking about. And maybe I gave it too short a shrift in my discussion, but that's certainly a lot of what's going on. The main character in my book, Billy Levine, had one of the most severe cases of PTSD that you can imagine. Um, but I think it's useful to connect this to some of the larger themes. You know, Sebastian Junger wrote a book, I think it's called Tribe. And if I remember the thrust of his argument correctly, it's that PTSD results when you fight a war that your society does not unanimously perceive as righteous. Because when people experience violence, when they kill people, when they see their friends killed, uh, that all has a very strong effect on the psyche. But if you're reintegrated into your society and there's a general sense around you among everyone that you know that what you did was justified, that what you went through was for a reason, then what we call PTSD resolves. Whereas if you come back to an alienated society like the United States, where there isn't a general sense that any of these if people are even aware that the wars are taking place, half of the people in the country will think that it's a horrific war crime that you participated in and that you're the bad guy. And I think that whereas only the other half looks at you as a hero and thinks that the war. So that all of these imbalances contribute strongly to
Yeah.
PTSD. I think there's an ethical component of it as well.
A related point, A.G. Garmack asking a question here, I'll just paraphrase it, which is obviously a key element of special operations is the way it projects U.S. power in a manner that's distinct from conventional operations, right? It's sometimes operating in secret, but in any case, operating in an irregular fashion. Um, so, to what degree is this whole mode of operation almost always going to be something that the general public is going to be only somewhat, only partially aware of? You think of these, these large conventional wars, whether it's the first Iraq War or the Korean War or the Vietnam War or the Second World War, these various large conflicts the U.S. has been involved with. These are things that are going to always be at a distance from people's understanding, and they're also something you're not supposed to necessarily talk about even years after the events. So, is this just an unresolvable problem with special operations?
Yes, and this is related to a bit of what we were talking about earlier about the idea that what they do is inherently unethical. And I know people have that can jar, that can be hard to integrate. What is this guy talking about? But I think it's worth recalling how new the concept of special operations is. It only goes back to the Korean War and really the Vietnam War that became more elaborated. Um, and the idea of using military force in secret, well, this is very much a creation of the American 20th century and the expansion of American empire through the use of secret military forces whose activities are hidden from the public. And there is a obvious anti-democratic aspect to this. Special operations is an anti-democratic institution in which the government carries out certain national security objectives for which it has not obtained explicit democratic consent. So that's what special operations is about, and that's another aspect to this complex phenomenon.
Let's just end with maybe your reflections on a related point, which is to some degree, the rise of special operations is about a changing nature, changing quality and practice of warfare, whether related to American empire or other factors. So clearly, we see war changing in a variety of ways. New technologies, whether drones or AI or information operations of various kinds. But where do you see these irregular warfare operations developing? Step a step away for a second from the criminality of particular operators. Where's the trend going? Maybe you could leave us with a few thoughts about where your investigations lead in terms of the changing quality of warfare.
Honestly, my sense of it was that after all of the all the negative press from 2016 to about 2021, under the Biden administration, the SOCOM did get a handle on things. You didn't hear much. There weren't cases of alleged war crimes. There weren't cases of operators doing crimes stateside. for several years, maybe 2 years or so. But now that President Trump it's not to be politically biased. I try not to have a political bias, but from what I've observed from President Trump's last administration, the specific policies that he's implemented, the people that he's put in charge, I would predict will contribute to a resurgence in all of this because you have people at state and CIA who are probably going to push for increased U.S. interventions abroad. And then within the military, you have people in DOD who are going to loosen ROE, loosen restrictions, and not emphasize ethical compliance. And the result of that is going to be just what we saw the last time around. And so my prediction, sadly, I hope it doesn't come true, but it would be that over the next 4 years, that you see you see more cases of ethical lapses in special operations.
Well, you've left us though with also a hopeful message in the sense that it sounds like more informed, more sensitive leadership can produce, better outcomes, which is, something a positive takeaway. Thank you so much, Seth, for joining us. Did you have any final words? And then thank you everybody in the audience for joining us as well. Maybe you want to close out with some thoughts before we say goodnight.
Yes, if this is to be prevented, the leadership will have to come from within the military. The mid-level military leaders can prevent this. They have the power to prevent this. So to conclude on one positive thing.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening.
Thank you.